Hello. Welcome to my show. My name is Bret. This is live every Thursday. And yes, we just crossed 175 streams. And over 100 of those are now a podcast. These shows, by the way, the Q&As don't normally make it to podcast just because we have so much other content to get into podcast from the other shows where we have guests and you can learn things from other people, that this show and the Q&A, which I keep wanting to split up into stuff, we never get to it. So you only get the answers here in this YouTube video. Maybe someday we'll have a chance to maybe have a different kind of show in there, or maybe even a different show that's just breaking up each question and answer. I don't know if anyone would like that. Like, give me a thumbs up and I can watch the counter if you like the idea of just a podcast where each episode's like a question and an answer. It's just one episode, 5 minutes. And I don't make short answers, so it's never going to be a 30-second answer. It's always going to be 5 minutes on my soapbox. So thanks for being here. If you've been in my courses, if you found me somewhere else, podcast, on YouTube searches, however you've arrived here today, thank you for coming. And for those that don't know, this is sponsored by you, the Patreon's patrons that come through Patreon. I always get those words back and forth. So I have a Patreon page. If you'd like to support this channel, you don't have to spend any money. You can actually just scroll down and you can click follow. Follow gets you 1 or 2 emails a week. It's about what's on this show, who's going to be the guests. For instance, next week we've got guests for like the next 3 weeks. We've got 4 weeks. We've got Anais from Aqua Security. She has a great YouTube channel as well, and she's going to be talking about Trivy and other open source that Aqua Security makes. And we've had Aqua on the show several times before, and this will be another one where we just talk about what they're creating. Then we've got two staff engineers actually, software engineers from VMware. We're going to talk about some VMware projects. Then after that, we've got Slim AI. If you haven't seen that, the new Docker Slim is the open source, and then Slim AI is the company that's here to help you make super custom images automatically so that you don't have to be a Dockerfile guru. So they're coming up next month. So the way you find out about that is here on the Patreon. So click to follow. If you'd like to support this show, the podcast, the open source, if you go to any of my open source on GitHub, which are now dozens of repos, you'll see links there that take you back here. So this is the way you can support this channel, my open source efforts, everything that's not in the courses. My courses, you go buy those on Udemy, but everything else is free. So you can join here for $5 a month. You get to hang out with us in Discord. We got this, well, everyone gets to hang out in Discord. You can do that right here. It's free. We have over 10,000 people in there. It's awesome. I'm very excited about that. But what we do need is more people engaged, and I've been thinking about let's opening up the floodgates for people to bring something they want to show off and create some sort of, maybe it's not always at the same time, doesn't matter, but we can start using the voice and video channels to share stuff there within the community. If you're interested, reach out in the Discord server, devops.fan. If you want to be a patron and you get into the High Fivers group, we do a monthly hangout, which is coming up next month. That we just did the one for this month, and we hang out here in the private channels for patrons and boosters. You can either boost the Discord server, so you don't have to sign up for Patreon. You can just boost the Discord. If you know what that is, then you know that's a thing, and you can do that, or you can become the High Fivers on Patreon. So you can do that. For the first question, by the way, hello everyone, by the way. Nikhil, hopefully I got that close. Fernando, hello. Kamajru, Dan, Paul, everybody, thank you for being here. So I'm going to hit it right off. I'm just going to go straight to it. Enough with the marketing and the advertising. So Dan is asking a bunch of questions. A couple of things was around favorite tools for Kubernetes, and they're loving the scaffold for development and Lens. So if you didn't know about Lens, Lens is probably the most feature-rich local desktop GUI made in Electron, I assume, but it's pretty fancy. It's got a lot of stuff in it. You can manage multiple clusters, and you have to have access to the Kubernetes API. But if you do, it's a great way to do it. You can do stuff with it on your local Docker desktop. You don't have to use just the Docker desktop GUI. You can use Lens. There's also another one called Infra. It's a different take on it, but I'm not sure that it's better than Lens. I'm not really an expert on comparing feature to feature. They just have similar features, and then they have different features. So you might want to check both out. I think they're both free for some of the features, or most of the features are free. And then Infra, I'm not sure. They did have a pricing thing. Never really. There's some stuff for, looks like $8 a month for that one. And then Lens, I think they have some sort of, they have a pricing one too. Yeah, free for personal. So yeah, the Teams thing is, it's like, I think it's syncing configs and allowing you to collaborate on the same clusters and stuff. I think that's what the team plan is. So they're around the same pricing. By the way, Infra, if you remember the old Docker desktop GUI, what was that called? Somebody in chat's going to remember. Way back in the day. Start with a K, I think. I could be wrong. Anyway, there was a GUI that came with like Docker Toolbox before we had Docker Desktop. And the team behind that, I believe, is the team behind Infra. So prior Docker employees, maybe. Can't remember exactly. All right, so the reason for that I'm talking about all of that is those are really the only things that I use besides the command line, other than Argo. So if there was a thing, everybody knows about Argo, I feel like, and if you don't, welcome to the club. You now know about Argo. But I'm just going to go to the Argo project. So Acuity was on the show just recently. They're the company behind Argo, and Argo is the sort of the open source components, and then they're providing a software as a service on top of that. So let's see if we can get, there we go. Yeah, I don't want the docs. So Argo CD is what I usually, like that goes in basically every cluster. In fact, I was recently testing out some new stuff in Docker and Kubernetes on DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is my favorite cloud for just easy setups. It's for personal stuff. It's great for small companies. They actually now have VPC networking and a lot of advanced features people don't realize. They have Lambda function-like things. They have S3 storage. They have managed databases. They have all that stuff now. They're not just droplets. But I like DigitalOcean because it tends to be cheaper than like AWS or Azure, way simpler. I can spin up a machine in one command and then spin it down in another command. It takes seconds. It's faster than EC2 in terms of spin up and tear down, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but it's in my impression it is. And so I use them for testing or for spinning up things that I don't want to have to do a full AWS. And so DigitalOcean has a Kubernetes provider that you can just spin up a Kubernetes cluster, and it has something where it's like Google Cloud Run. It's called DigitalOcean Apps, I think, app platform. And it runs just standard containers. So it's like Google Cloud Run, Azure and AWS both have this. I always forget the names of the different products. Different dozen ways you can run on each cloud a container. So I was basically having them deploy a bunch of the container that I wanted a bunch of replicas of, but I didn't need the complexity of Kubernetes. I'm getting my story. I'm getting to the point. So on Kubernetes, if I want to take configuration or images in my GitHub or in Docker Hub, but in GitHub, if I want to take those and I want to run them on DigitalOcean, what's the easiest way to do that? Well, these platforms that don't require me to write Kubernetes YAML are way easier because they can usually watch my images or watch my repo for me and notice the changes. In fact, the DigitalOcean one, it'll watch the repo and then it'll go ahead and build the Docker image when the repo changes for me. So it's actually doing a little bit of the CI, building of the image. It pushes it to the DigitalOcean registry, the container registry there at DigitalOcean, and then it automatically deploys to their servers. I tell it how much stuff I want in the container. It's very easy. I can avoid all the YAML. However, it is limited. For example, I couldn't reach out from in that container and hit a remote port 22. So I was actually trying to run a little utility that is called WebSSH, and it allows me to run an SSH client with Xterm.js. Anyway, it's you've probably used Xterm before, Xterm.js, and it's in everything. It's in Visual Studio Code. But I was wanting to run it in a browser so I could do things in other places without having full Visual Studio Code and not needing a terminal like on my iPad. Anyway, a lot of those cloud run container things, they don't have all the ports. They don't have all the access. They don't have all the security stuff. So I basically am forced to go back to running in Kubernetes. But in order to run in Kubernetes and have it automatic, it's like they don't yet have, that I'm aware of, a lot of these even managed Kubernetes platforms aren't just going to watch a repo of source code or even of Kubernetes customized YAML and then automatically deploy it and update it every time that's changed. I'm not aware of that on DigitalOcean or the others. It usually ends up requiring you to have some other component for GitOps, like Argo. So one of my big complaints is, like, we need the clouds to make this even easier so that all that we have to write is a Helm chart, or let's see, we can write a customized, preferably customized, because in most small shops, I think customized is the way to go for your Kubernetes and not use not create your own Helm charts. To me, Helm charts work better in scenarios where you have a really complicated app. You have dozens of containers, complicated configurations. You need init containers. You need all these things, and or maybe you're shipping your code to other people. So you're providing other people your software that you make
That's where Helm charts shine. I think customized for internal apps that are not needing to be used in multiple teams and multiple wide array of configurations, and the only thing you really need to do is change the environment variables and some secrets. That's all great. Use Kustomize for that. So these clouds don't yet go far enough for us so that we don't need that component like Argo. So Argo is still needed in all the clusters I do. And then, so I put that on just about every one of them. And then I create an Argo file, and that talks to my Kustomizer, my Helm charts. That's kind of what I'm doing today. And Acuity has got a beta for a SaaS version of that. Basically, you run Argo in the cloud, and then it connects to all your clusters, and you don't have to spin it up yourself. You don't have to worry about permissions, manually setting up certificates, all those things that you would have to do to run Argo in every cluster. It's a work, and I'm looking to avoid that. So that was my adventure this week. But that's related to your question there, Dan, that check out Argo if you haven't. That's something that goes into every cluster. That's how that's how my customers auto ship. That's how I auto ship all my app changes. And Dan also monopolized the next question. He's rolling in with the great questions. Build packs versus Gib versus Dockerfile versus Spring Boot for building images. So that's a great conversation. Let me just make it sure anybody doesn't have any related questions on chat. Okay, not yet. All right. So Dan, this is a great conversation. So build packs, let me just sum all these up. I think that for specific frameworks and languages like Java, like Python, or like Ruby, where the community has come together with a very popular project for custom making an image, assuming your app is built the standard way of that framework, right? For example, if it's a Node.js app, it should only have Node.js in it, right? It should only have JavaScript or TypeScript that you then transform, and it doesn't go and do a bunch of other things or bundle different parts that are outside that normal. Then you might be able to find a project that just takes your app and throws it in a Node.js container, very lean and in a very optimized way. And those, I think, work well. And that's what Slim AI is doing. If you go back in this channel, we've mentioned that several times before. And let me just show this. Slim AI, they're also the people that do Docker Slim. So Docker Slim is free, it's an open source thing. And then Slim AI is going to be their SaaS platform, but they're going to be on the show next month. And they're doing this. They're basically saying, we're going to make bespoke custom designs for each framework and language that are common. And that's the common, like with Ruby, often it's a Rails server. So that's very predictable, right? Rails is a bunch of configuration and conventions around how you make a Ruby app. So those are predictable, and these projects that make a really optimized, secure, lean image, I think are great. So if you want to do that, do that. If you're someone who's just like, I want everything to be a Docker file, I want to be in complete control, then that's fine. I think there's a lot of people that are maybe overwhelmed by multi-stage and all the advanced setups that Docker files can now do. So they might want to do something like build packs, which to me, build packs are great when you don't know what needs to be in your image. You don't have the exact requirements of all your apt or yum dependencies, and then your npm dependencies, and then maybe your Ruby bundler dependencies. If you don't know all that stuff and you haven't handcrafted a optimized Docker file that has a stage for testing and a stage for production so that it doesn't have the testing things in it and the dev dependencies, right? So you can do all that in Docker files. And I think eventually people graduate to that. But build packs are sort of a generic way of bundling an app. I am not personally a fan of build packs just because I know Docker files well. I know how to make a better image than build packs can do. Build packs are sort of, hey, let's just throw a whole bunch of stuff at you and let's hope what you need is in there, right? And you probably have a bunch of things that you don't need. That's at least the last time I used build packs. That was my experience. And it works great for things like Heroku. But when you're scanning your images and you have a security team that has minimum CVE counts, right? They're very concerned about every vulnerability that's in your image when they scan it. And you're trying to even just cut out 30 meg of space here and 20 meg of space there, and you absolutely don't want any optional dependencies in your production image, then I think that Dockerfile is still the way to go. Now, it remains to be seen if stuff like Slim AI can get enough support and get enough community involvement to have a very consistent sort of building pack. I hate to say build pack, but to pack your image together and build it, hence that great name for build packs. But I think there's a lot of these options, and I think it's very much to the team. It's very much a culture thing. It's very much the requirements. Do you have security requirements, speed requirements? Is it just about easy, like you want the easy button? Then building a custom Docker file yourself may not be the easy button anymore. It was the only way we had 7-8 years ago. But there's lots of other opinions, and of course these all create standard OCI images that you can run in any Kubernetes or Docker environment. So it doesn't really matter how you build it. It's the same thing that we've been dealing with for years, where different languages have different build methods, different opinions about different tooling for building. So it's not any different in images. It's just creating the same artifact, and the tool you might just like to use a tool that's closer to your framework so that you don't have to live in Docker land with Docker files. And I think that's really a very personal decision. If I think that, by the way, there's actually a video on DevOps Toolkit. This is on YouTube. I'm going to pimp Victor's stuff. Victor, let's see, build pack. Let's see if I can find it with it real quick. Build pack. Yeah, so he just did, 3 weeks ago, he just did this video. And I'm going to put this in chat. Oops. Wrong button. So that YouTube link I just put in there is to a Victor Farsick video on his channel, DevOps Toolkit, that he recently did his own opinionated comparison of build packs versus Docker. And he kind of has the same opinion I do, that, if you know Docker files, stick with those. Like if you already have learned the hard stuff of a Docker file, like chown, chmod, permissions, creating users, multi-stage, build kit, if you've learned all that stuff, then that is your jam. That is where you should stay. I'm not really sure that any of these other ones are going to give you absolutely better experiences. And Docker, you know what you're going to get. Like you have finite control over every step of the way. But these other ones are going to apply opinions, and I'm not sure that they're necessarily faster, especially with some of the newer build kit features, like Link, which allows you to actually run an update on a previous layer without breaking the chain or what we call cache busting all the other layers. That's a new thing called Link. Just look it up on Docker's blog. By the way, Docker also had a recent 9 tips for containerizing your Spring Boot code. So if you're interested, this is a blog article from another Docker captain, Ajit. And I don't know Johan, but Johan, I'm not sure if he's a captain or at Docker. I don't know. We have so many captains now. Anyway, so there's some stuff there on Java. You can actually just go through the Docker blog. They probably have lots of Java stuff there. And there's also great DockerCon talks you can look up on Java-specific projects and stuff like that, in case you're someone in Java. Okay, moving on. Thank you so much for those great questions, Dan. Hitting it off with complicated topics. I love it. Is Docker Swarm, this is a great question, Docker Swarm being developed and maintained actively? It depends on what your definition of actively is. Yes and no. So Mirantis continues to support Swarm and reaffirmed just a month or two ago on the Mirantis blog that Swarm is still on their plans. So if you didn't know, Mirantis bought 2/3 of Docker before the pandemic. So back in 2019, they bought essentially a lot of the closed source, like the enterprise software, and like what we know now used to be called. It's now Mirantis platform or something, but it used to be called Docker. It was Docker Desktop, Docker Data Center. Then it was Docker Enterprise, and there was the DTR product, which is the registry. There's all these enterprise products. So Mirantis buys that, right? It doesn't change any of the open source licensing. none of Docker's open source changed licensing. So people were really worried that somehow it was affecting the open source, and it didn't. Mirantis bought the closed source bits for enterprises because that's their jam. That's what they do. And then they got all of the enterprise sales and tech support people and all that, and they all moved over to Mirantis. That left Docker with less than 100 people, and Docker could go back to their roots and focus on dev tooling like Docker Desktop, like Compose. And you've seen them do that since then. They've got the new Docker subscription. They've added a ton of features. Docker Desktop, we now have Docker extensions. Compose was completely rewritten in Golang, and it's now built into the Docker engine, or, well, the Docker CLI as an add-on. And they just keep going and going. They now have SBOMs and Docker Scan and all these features, right? So that's all local developer stuff. So Swarm isn't Docker's concern anymore. They can still ship it because it's open source, and Mirantis supports it. So Mirantis has had one engineer for years now, all working on Swarm stuff, but we've only had maybe one feature a year. And we haven't had any new features because we're waiting on Docker to ship a new major version of Docker Engine this year, which is their plan. They're planning on shipping, it's in beta now, a major version of Docker Engine and CLI. And so we're expecting or hoping that there will be some new Swarm features in that. I'm trying to remember there was what the Swarm feature was that they added a year or 2 years ago in the last major, because Docker's still on version 20 from 2020, 2004. That's the major version that Docker Engine and Command Line are on. So you won't see major new features of Swarm until Docker ships a new engine, and they've really slowed down the pace on that. They're only shipping minor patch updates. And then when they want to add new features nowadays, Docker Desktop adds those features that are just plugins to Docker. So they're not really changing the core engine of Docker because it's nice and stable. So long story longer there is, yes, there are new features coming. The most notable that we're all anticipating is CSI support. So that's in the Kubernetes world, that is storage. All right. Docker doesn't have CSI support. So it has storage plugins that are very proprietary, very much the Docker API way. And those are Docker Engine plugins. But no one's really doing those anymore. Everyone's moved on to Kubernetes, networking, Kubernetes storage. So CSI support was an idea that they committed to, and Mirantis in their blog, I believe, has been talking about it for years, saying it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And somewhere, let me see if I can find it. Swarm. See, that's 2020. That's 2021. They confirm it. Mirantis is committed to Swarm in 2022. So look at Mirantis as it's all open source. Swarm Kit itself is the repo, and Mirantis is the ones building on that. So I see PRs coming in. I see back and forth with the community, because this is a community-driven product backed by Docker Inc. and Mirantis. So I think that here's the real answer. If Swarm has features that you can use today that are easy for you to use today, and it works for you, and you can use something like Portainer on top of it. Portainer IO goes on top of it as a GUI manager that's kind of like the ultimate manager for not just Docker Swarm, but just for Docker, for Swarm, for Kubernetes, and now Nomad, all in one GUI. You can use that. But if it doesn't work in Swarm today, whatever you're trying to do, and you can try that, you can try Swarm, then you're going to have to go to Kubernetes, because you can't expect Docker to fix anything or to add major new features this year in Swarm. We're just all hoping for that one feature of storage support, because that was one of the things to me. We could all use Traffic. Traffic supports this for your proxying and your ingress, right? So Traffic still supports Swarm and Docker. You still have the GUI and Portainer. The other major gap was in storage, so that we could easily manage storage across multiple nodes, or use a third-party storage provider to use the cloud or whatever. And that used to be called Datadog, or not Datadog, RexRay, which was a dog mascot. That's where my brain went. RexRay was the project we were all using. That's what I used back in 2019, but it has since fallen into disarray, and the bugs weren't getting fixed. So that's a really long answer. I still hope Swarm has a future. I still think there's a place for it. It's still built into Docker. It still works on servers. But if you're trying to do persistent data and store volumes across servers, or in a redundant fashion, or use remote third-party storage, then Swarm's not going to be for you. If you're looking to use if you're looking to transition to Kubernetes, then just go to Kubernetes out of the gate. Don't start with Swarm and then knowing that you're going to go to Swarm, away from Swarm, and then to Kubernetes eventually. I'm stuttering a lot today. I don't know why I'm doing that. Hopefully that helps, Nikhil. Hopefully that helps. All right. I'm going to speed it up a little bit so we don't have such a backlog of questions. Fernando just brought the course. You're loving Docker Mastery. Great. News is that I just recorded more episodes of updating the installs last week. I've added 2 or 3 new written lectures that talk about something that maybe is new that we don't have a video in yet. And then if you want to check the updates and keep track of all the stuff happening in the courses, because I know there's some people that are still finding issues and we're working diligently to fix those, is to go to bret.show/course updates. So this project, and I'll just put it in chat. This is a GitHub project, so I'm doing this all in open source, and I'm keeping all of the things we're fixing, all the things that we're currently working on. We're adding a new section on entry point and command, and then we're going to add a new section on multi-stage. Multi-stage is also taught a little bit in the Node.js course, but we haven't added it back to Docker Mastery. So there are a few videos in there that mention it, but I don't have a really in-depth section that goes deep. And what you can do if you're interested in multi-stage, again, I have so many videos elsewhere, is you can go to my github.com Bret Fisher profile. If you just search for Bret Fisher on GitHub, and you'll see a list of my videos and hands-on stuff, including multi-stage stuff from DockerCon. Let's see, where's it at? It's called Node.js Rocks in Docker. So it's about Node.js, but it applies to almost every language. It's not really that Node.js specific. But we go through multi-stage and you build a multi-stage in my 30-minute video. So I didn't add that to the course. I felt like just adding a conference video, more conference videos, because I have a couple in there, wasn't as good as adding lectures and assignments and stuff. So we're building all that, and then we're going to add that soon. But thanks for that. All right. All right. Any course resource for solo developers to build and deploy their own apps? So yeah, I would love to make a course. I actually have the domain called Solo DevOps. And I'd love to make a course that is all of these tools specifically for a single person. What's the easiest, simplest way? If I had to do it from scratch today, and I was just a single person, and I was just wanting to deploy their own stuff, and I wasn't trying to learn the tool that my company uses. For example, your company might use EKS on AWS, right, for the Kubernetes. So you might have to learn that and learn all the AWS stuff. But if I was just trying to do the minimal infrastructure so that I didn't have to use a complicated cloud, and I just wanted to focus on development. And I'm also at least trying to learn some things around Docker and Kubernetes and some of the basics, right? I'm not trying to be a guru yet. I'm just learning the basics. I would use DigitalOcean Cloud. I would use their Kubernetes offering, which deploys and manages the Kubernetes for me. And it can even do auto updates at night of the Kubernetes versions, the API versions and stuff. And then I would deploy Argo in that cluster, Argo CD, that basically sits there, and it's basically one file. You don't even have to use files. You can technically just use the Argo CD GUI. It's a Helm chart. It's really easy to deploy. And you can just leave the default password, or not. Well, you set one default password. You don't need to worry about RBAC and permissions and all that. You just give yourself the admin password, and then you put that in your Kubernetes cluster, and then it can watch your repos of your apps or your images in your registry. And then it'll just constantly update those on the Kubernetes system. So that's a full auto deployment based on commits you're putting in your main branch or your master branch. And that, to me, gives me a little bit of Kubernetes. So I would need to make a few Kubernetes YAML files, right, for my deployments and my services and stuff. But that's good, because to me, that's a core dev skill now. You need to be able to understand the very basics of how to make Kubernetes YAML. So I would do that. Then I would probably just, if it was just me, I probably wouldn't make an Argo CD YAML. I would just go in the Argo CD GUI and click around just to be lazy. I'm just being honest. I'll just be lazy, go in the GUI. But if you want true infrastructure as code, then, I would I could use Terraform to create those DigitalOcean assets and use that Terraform and store it in GitHub and in a repo. And then I would take my Argo CD YAML and I would store that in a repo. So you could do all that, right? Your Kubernetes repo with YAML in it, just a few files. Your Argo CD, just a repo with a file or two in it. And then your Terraform, maybe a different repo, just, keep them separate. Or you can put it all in one repo and just, wing it. So that's probably what I would do to keep it simple. But yet I'm still using all open source. And then from there, you can decide, do I want to deploy a Prometheus chart, a Helm chart on my cluster and then learn that? Or a logging chart with something like Loki. If I can just deploy a Helm chart and then learn it on my Kubernetes cluster running in the cloud, I don't have to manage the cluster. I don't have to, update it and determine which Kubernetes distribution I'm going to use. I would do that, right? Since you're asking. All right, Fernando has a question. How do you suggest managing access to databases and APIs for the analytics team? Not sure if we should include some sidecar container, forward the port, or something else. That's a little bit of a complicated question, Fernando. It very much comes down to what is your team used to, what permissions and things are you allowed to do, and then managing access to databases. So what I presume you're talking about is the database port. So they have to have a database authentication. There are other tools now that, let me just pull some of these up. There are other tools now that are trying to solve this in a different fashion, in a more generic fashion. Hey, I got a super chat. Thanks, Nikhil. Thank you so much for that super chat. You get the reggae horn. I appreciate it. So what was I going to say? Oh, here we go. Something that is interesting that is just brand new, and I'm going to have to share. Let's see. I want to share this screen. I want to share this. So, all right, this is Docker Desktop today. It has extensions. Extensions is a brand new thing, just came out months ago. And if I go to add extensions, there's this marketplace. And in the marketplace, there's a couple of tools in here that I wouldn't actually have thought would have been day one things. We can talk about telepresence, but what I'm really wanting to talk about is Tailscale. So what you might be looking at, might want to consider, is Tailscale, and it can be installed by your team, by the team that's, Tailscale is a sort of a I don't know if you want to call it a mesh VPN. I've heard somebody's probably used it. So if anyone in chat has used Tailscale, check it out. And Tailscale is not the only game in town. Let me show you. So just check out Tailscale, because what it is there's several other competitors in this space for Kubernetes even specifically, but Tailscale is a little broader and can work not just in Kubernetes, right? And so the idea is that you're giving people sort of a modern approach to VPN to specific resources, and it's decentralized. So it's not something where, you can see the graph here. It's not something where there's this one endpoint and that's how you get in, and then once you get into that, you have access to everything. That's a traditional VPN. There's an appliance, or you're paying for a cloud VPN. And that sort of legacy, that's less flexible. It requires a security or firewall expert or whatever. And in this case, this is much more of a decentralized solution where everybody's working from home, and I got assets over in this cloud and assets in this data center, and I only want to give them the assets, these 2 pods or these 3 containers or whatever. And so Tailscale is just one of a few tools out there, but it's now an add-on to Docker Desktop. So it could make it even easier for people to run it without having to configure stuff locally. I haven't actually tried it in Docker Desktop yet because it's so new. So if anyone's tried it, let me know. That's one way I would probably consider doing it. I wouldn't worry about taking the database port and trying to put it on the public internet and then worrying about database authentication as the only boundary. You're trying to proxy that specific database. There are already these other tools that do that, and they're very specialized. So if someone knows competitors to Tailscale, throw them in the chat as well, because I am not the expert on all the different options there, but if I just looked real quick. Yeah. Not finding anything else right now, but good question. All right. Ernest is here with a patient question. Is there a quick video to summarize? I heard about Docker and Kubernetes, but as an IT teacher, I don't have any idea of how they work. Brief overview. So, Ernest, I'm not going to give you a brief overview of containers, Docker, and everything else because two things. There is quick videos here on YouTube, and then I have an article, if you'd like to read it, that is actually Kubernetes versus Docker. So it actually teaches you the core principles of Docker, like why does Docker need to exist, all in a blog article, and I just recorded videos and put them back in my course. That's actually the first 2 or 3 videos of my Docker Mastery course. Links below. You can buy it for less than $20 US. And I know that's probably not the long answer, and you'd rather just look up a YouTube video because you're on YouTube. So you can do that. And I'm planning on putting those videos I just recorded last month, which is a more revised 2022 look. But I also have articles about it. So Kubernetes versus Docker was 1 in 3 of a series I did. That it's not just a little. There's 1,000 blog articles about what is Docker, and I don't prescribe to a lot of those because for one, I took days to write this, so I put a lot of effort into it to give you just the details that you need, to give you some origin background. Also, the website has dark mode now, and then talk about what containers are and the 3 key innovations you need to know about from Docker, why those innovations are still absolutely relevant today in everything you do, including Kubernetes. I believe this is the way that everyone will be shipping software, right? Today, most companies, the top 1,000 companies, almost all of them have Docker and Kubernetes or something like that. There's like a crazy percentage. So there's all different ways of running containers, but containers are the new norm. Functions as a service and serverless, they all run in containers the last I checked, or almost all of them. And that OCI compliant container is a very popular way to, regardless of the tool, to run applications with all its dependencies. And then it goes through how is Kubernetes different from that. And basically Docker is a single server focus, and it just tries to manage things on one server, and Kubernetes runs many servers. So Kubernetes is just many Dockers or many other container runtimes, and it just runs them all and manages them all from a single client. So you can run an entire data center from a single command line using Kubernetes. Hopefully that helps. Which infrastructure as a service do we use? Well, I'm sure you're asking the whole room. So everybody, if you have opinions, I use whatever my students and clients use. So I have to be in all clouds because I'm an educator. So I'm in AWS a lot of times for clients. Most of my clients are on AWS. I'd say like 30% of them are, 30 to 40% are either Azure or Google. I myself am in DigitalOcean. I have had clients in the past on Heroku. I have had, way back in the day, maybe 10 years ago, I had clients on Rackspace back when there was like real hardware and they didn't really go to the newer clouds. So I've been everywhere. I have a preference for easy, so I tend to like easy things like DigitalOcean or Linode or Scaleway or any of these that are very focused, small clouds that solve a very specific problem, but I'm also very comfortable across all the clouds. So anyway, that's my answer. Oh, Dan says he learned how to use a Docker file from taking my course. Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the compliment. When do you start using Kubernetes operators, Anil? When do you start using Kubernetes operators for the installation of microservices? So when there is no right answer, the answer is when you feel like you need it. If you know how to do it and you need to learn something like that, a specific tool like an operator that's focused on microservices, That's a very specific deployment methodology. So I tend to start everyone out the same way, generic, right? We first create Kubernetes manifest, then we learn either Kustomize or Helm. Usually, if they're a smaller team, less than 20 people total in terms of software, managing the software lifecycle, then we'll start with Kustomize. We'll learn the YAML for that. Then we'll learn Argo. We'll use Argo, maybe Flux, but usually nowadays Argo, to get their code or their images into Kubernetes and update it automatically. And then as the team niches down, they get very specific into their language and their frameworks, there might be better tools like these microservice operators or something, which I've never used, to be honest. I've never used a microservice operator. I'm sure that it's very tailored, and if you fit that model, that might be a good way for you to go. It may not solve every problem, so you might have to run some things a traditional way and then move to some operator like that for your microservices only, because you may not have all microservices. There's operators for deploying database servers, but if you're not someone who's wanting to run your own database server, and I generally don't run databases myself. I don't recommend people run database servers themselves. Just because you can doesn't mean you can run an entire business on it in a safe, secure, redundant, backups tested. Like, you've got to do all that stuff, monitor it, and that's what the cloud-hosted databases do for you. So just because I can run a database doesn't mean I should. And there are operators for that. I don't use them because, other than for playing and learning and teaching, because whenever I'm in the cloud with a company, we're using cloud-hosted databases so that, we don't have to spend $150,000 a year on a DBA to maintain all that stuff or whatever, right? Eventually, you're still going to need a DBA if you got enough cloud databases, but you can push that a little bit off if you host it in the cloud a little bit. That's a great question, though. I know. Thank you. How do I debug Kubernetes pods in VS Code? Well, so VS Code has the Kubernetes plugin. You can use it kind of like Lens. Lens is it's not necessarily a troubleshooting tool, but Lens is at least a GUI that will let you see things, and it tries to detect patterns. Infra also does the same thing a little bit. There are plenty of other tools out there. In fact, I've mentioned several recently. Troubleshoot.sh. This is a troubleshooting tool specifically for Kubernetes. Troubleshoot.sh. So this is an open source tool, but it doesn't tell you what's wrong. All it's really doing is dumping out all the information, all the logs, all the manifests, all the configurations. That's what troubleshoot's all about. So it's going to make it easier for you to read up and search things and find out what's potentially wrong, but you have to still do the work. Something like Komodoro, Komodoro.com, Komodor. I'll put these in chat. Komodoro is a troubleshooting tool that's a platform. So you actually sign up. I think you get a certain amount for free. I'm not sure. And you use their website, and it jumps into your cluster. You have to install it, basically parts of it in your cluster, and then it tries to determine what's going on. For example, is your app crashing because you set the memory limits too low and it's hitting the memory limits? Now, you can find that out with the kubectl command line, just using kubectl describe pod, for example, to see if you're having events that are problematic and causing your pod to crash. But it's Kubernetes command line isn't going to make it bright red and tell it to you in your face. That's where something like Komodoro can check out. And there are other tools in this area as well. That's just 2 examples. Those are 2 that I've used. So hopefully that helps. Yeah. All right, let's keep going. Let's keep this show rolling. Great questions. So, Tayab, that microservices pushing changes. Yeah, so it's really about optimizing the build and deploy chain, right? So for me, I go where the code's at. This is probably one of my next courses that will be built, maybe not this year, probably next year, but a GitHub Actions focused course for DevOps, because I already have so much of that here. If you, again, go back to my GitHub, let's see if I can get back there. So I did a DockerCon talk. This was that talk, right? Node.js rocks in Docker. Again, we're just on my GitHub profile. That was the That was my DockerCon talk, but I also did one called for the All Hands, which is basically Docker Birthday. I should have called it Docker Birthday. I did a whole video. It's a 20 or 30-minute video on GitHub Actions and how to automate your build and deploy workflow, mostly focused on build, because Argo CD with Kubernetes is really the way to go for your microservices. And there are, again, little bespoke tools for specific frameworks or specific conventions of microservices that might be more tailored. But if you just start out to begin with, you're going to create images of each microservice, and then you're going to do that with GitHub Actions, which will watch the repo, and every time you commit to the repo in a PR, it will go and build an image of that repo. If you're doing a monolith repo where you're putting a bunch of different microservices all in the same repo, then you would create a GitHub action for each one of those repos. That's how I can do it. That's how I prefer to do it. Someone else I know, they actually write scripts that just go through every single one of them, every single directory, and then build the images. But you have to do some fancy bash scripting to make sure that you only do a subdirectory. He basically only wanted one GitHub action to do everything, no matter how many microservices there are. I would probably prefer to create one GitHub action as a template and it's called a reusable template. And then I would just make a new one each time I made a microservice. And then that file could be 25 lines of YAML, maybe, not even that much, that would just spin up the image. It would build the image, deploy it based on the name of the directory or something that it was in. And there would be all these images in that repo for all the different microservices. And then I'd have one more repo for Argo that tracks each one of those in manifest. So I'd have some Kubernetes customized YAML and Argo YAML to automatically deploy all those to my cluster. And so each time I added a new microservice, I just do three things. I go and copy and make a new GitHub action from the copy of the YAML that's there. Again, reusable. That's all in this video. And then I would go back to that other repo I have for Kubernetes. I would copy that YAML and make a new one, and then that's how it would go, right? I would basically be adding probably, depending on the complexity, 3 or 4 files, a very short amount of YAML for each microservice each time. And you do that once per microservice, right? So it seems like a lot, but once you get it all set up initially, even if you have 30 or 40 microservices, when you create a new one, you just make those 3 files and you're done. All right. Great questions, everyone. When having small, multiple applications, dev by one team, which is best, multiple swarms or one swarm, multiple stacks? You asked the same question twice. So, Fernando, if you're on swarm, a stack, you want a stack. If it needs to talk to other apps in that stack, then it goes in that stack. That's normally how I approach it. You could basically have 2 stacks or multiple stacks that all share a same network that you've created ahead of time, or they hard code the network name so they can all, because that's how Docker networks work in Swarm, right? You have to create a new network, put containers onto that network, and then they can access other containers on that network. So I put all the containers that are in that solution that need to talk to each other in the same stack. So it's really up to you. I think always start simpler. Don't start, if you don't know, if you're not sure the answer, don't create 1,000 stacks, right? Just create one stack. It can have dozens of containers. That's fine. And then when you start to see problems, like maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure what kind of problems you would have with that, but if you saw a limitation that you needed to split that thing out, you can do this with containers nowadays, and it's not horrible, right? You can split things out later, and you only have to change a few files, and you might have very little downtime, probably just minutes or less, in order to redesign that to move the containers around. So I would not have a fear around one stack to start with and only adding new stacks when I had good reasons, like reasons that were painful, that I was solving a pain point, right? Keep it simple. It's always what I try to do. Keep it as simple as I can so that it's easier to maintain, and it's easier for someone else to maintain, because we're all busy. We don't have time for that. We want someone else to maintain our work, and we're not going to be in the same job forever, so we need to make it easier for the next person. Hello, great question. Security, Docker security, scanning, build pipelines. what open source and enterprise as well tools do I need to use? Well, I just showed you that all hands. Let's go right back to that. That same link, I just put it in chat a few minutes ago. That all hands video shows how I use Trivy or Sneak to scan every image after I build it. And those examples are all here. And it links you, you can actually scroll down, and it links you to a bunch of other stuff. So there's just tons of documentation here, but you can see if you go there, if you scroll down, there'll be this GitHub Actions templates, and it shows you all these different ways, including Trivy and Sneak, on how to scan your images. Now, you might go with something else to scan your image, like a third-party dedicated tool. Like you might just pay for Sneak, S-N-Y-K, and it has all these security features. It scans your code, it scans your images, it tells you all that stuff. It does even more than that. It creates SBOMs or building materials. So if you don't want to do this on GitHub and you want just sort of a turnkey solution, something like Sneak is the way I'd go. Any suggestions on taking backups of databases which are hosted in Kubernetes? Great question, Akash. Sorry if I mispronounced the name. The Valero is probably the most popular that I'm aware of. It's an open source Valero. So it's open source backups, not just databases, but backups of all volumes and other things in Kubernetes. So I put that link in chat. Go check that project out. I have had them on the show before. I think they were here last year. The Valero team was showing off backups. And it works very much like you would think. It actually puts backup assets in different namespaces, and it does what you kind of expect the product to do. You create schedules, you create sort of templates and stuff like that for your backups. Nikhil says, I'd be one of the first to buy a course for solo developers. Yeah, I mean, you could just go to solodevops.com. I bought this domain. It just redirects to my website. But I have this dream one day, because when I do talks, when I used to do them in the real world, I would ask people in the room quite often, how many of you are the only DevOps person in your team? Or because, you know, I was doing a talk around DevOps topics, so I assumed the people are there for DevOps. And it would be usually around a quarter of the room. Whether that was 100 people or 1,000 people in the room, it'd be about a quarter of the room. And those people deserve simpler solutions, easier solutions. Yeah. By the way, I'm going to be at KubeCon. So if anyone here, where did I put that? I'm going to be at, oh, I have too many windows open. I'm going to be at KubeCon North America in Detroit. So if anybody's going to be there, make sure to ping me in Discord. And when I get closer to it, I'll probably put out some stuff on Patreon and my socials. So maybe we can have a little meetup, a little happy hour or something, or have lunch together at the conference or something. Yeah. So if you're going to be there, I didn't make it to Spain this year, but this is going to be my first real world conference this year. I'm very excited to get back to real world conferences and hopefully not get COVID again, Kube COVID. So yeah, if you're going to be there, reach out to me, Twitter, whatever. And we'll meet up. We'll do some high-fiving. I'm going to install OpenZipkin in Kubernetes to distributed tracing of microservices. Oh, you're trying to install OpenZipkin. I've not used that one. Let me know, Dan. Especially if you're in the Discord server. Just at me in Discord if you want to make sure I don't miss it. Because we have, with so many people in there now, we have lots of chats going on all the channels, and I don't see every message in Discord nowadays. Yeah, teleport. Sabin's talk about teleport and tailscale. Yeah, teleport's pretty cool too. I like that one. But tailscale sounds like something that I really kind of want. I want, like I have my home servers. I have stuff in DigitalOcean. Like instead of just opening up SSH ports, which is what I do, I probably should do something a little bit more secure. Well, SSH is secure, but something a little bit more cohesive instead of just DNS and SSH keys. It's easy for one person to just open up SSH and you're done. But when you need database access and other stuff like that, that's the great. Yeah, these other tools. NetMaker. Thanks, Akash. Nine Touch says, you love my course on Udemy. All right. What are you planning to design new courses and update current courses? So thank you so much. The current courses while they do have videos that are needing updates, like the Kubernetes 118 has a few videos that need to be changed. Everything else is the same. The Docker installs are the next thing, and I think I shared earlier on my Docker on my GitHub page, there is a project. If you just go into my GitHub page and go to projects, you can see all the work we're doing. I have an editor, I have a team, I have a content creator. So we have new content coming out in Docker Mastery, which will be around entry point scripts and customize the entry point and command. Then we've got updates for Kubernetes, including the 1.18 updates on the run command. It really only affects run because ingress has already been updated. We just updated ingress this year. Last year, we updated all of the stuff to work, except for like one or two edge cases. We updated all the courses to work with Apple M1 and ARM. So all my images and examples now are being built in ARM for ARM, like Raspberry Pis, which is ARM v7, and then ARM 64. So there's a lot going on in the courses. It's just maybe the video you see, there's a few of them still that are in the list. And if you go to that project, you'll actually see, I've even earmarked, let's see if I can find it. I've even earmarked ones that are just for a deprecation, right? So whether is it broken or is it deprecated? So I use labels and I manage all this stuff. And we, depends on the we knocked out 2 or 3 last week. So yeah, there's stuff that happens. So, okay, long story longer. I'm sorry to be so detailed on that. The next course is probably going to be either the GitHub Actions course for DevOps, specifically about GitHub Actions, because I think that's the platform to beat now. GitLab is great, but I think more people are on GitHub than on GitLab. So I just want to get help as many people as possible. And then it's either that or a DevOps Essentials. No tools. I'm not going to teach any tools in that course. It's only going to be about fundamentals of the software lifecycle, managing that from a DevOps perspective. It's about workflows, psychology, why does DevOps exist? Those principles, if you haven't read the DevOps handbook or taken any of these other DevOps foundations, it's not, we don't need to go learning Jenkins in order to understand DevOps as a true fundamental level, right? At a true fundamental level. So I wanted that course to exist so that when people say, hey, I don't know DevOps yet, and then they go look on Udemy, and when you look on Udemy, all those courses, they're teaching you tools. They're not necessarily, they might do a little bit of the background of the why, but I want a course for managers and for IT, management and VPs. I want them to understand DevOps at a true foundational level. And it doesn't have to be 10 hours, right, of content in order to do that. So I want to make that course. And so I'm not sure yet which one. We're going to get through all these updates, a lot of the updates I just talked about, and then we're going to do that. So thanks for asking. In the ocean of tools available, what is the decision matrix you employ when choosing which DevOps tool to use? It very much depends on, is the team, I try to change as little as possible in the team. If they've already got a tool that can do automation, because all these tools, when you say DevOps tool, what I really think you're talking about is automation. So you want to automate as much of the process between a developer makes a commit on their local system or wherever they're editing code, and then an app is in production running for customers. So there's all this stuff in the middle, and that you might call DevOps. Okay, let's just say that that's what that is. DevOps is more than that, but let's just say we're talking about that. That's automation platforms, and there's tons of them. I default to GitHub. If they have something already, we'll try to use that. If they're on GitLab or, if they're on any other CI provider, if they're running their own or they're on a SaaS or they're using a cloud-based one, we will try to use that first so that I don't have to make them change their entire platform. And then from there, if it's Kubernetes, I will try to urge them to go Kubernetes because that way they can run it wherever. There's other cool things like Google Cloud Run and these other tools that don't require Kubernetes, but they don't all work the same way in every place. So if you want consistency, and a lot of places are focused on multi-cloud now, so if they're worried about that all affects the tooling. So I think a lot of those tools are on this channel. If you just go back in time, it would be sort of a decision matrix of what do you have today? Is that up to date? Can we easily use that? Is it accessible from your phone? Is it, one of these things is I'm always trying to get closer to the developer. So if the developer's on GitHub, if that's where your code's at, we're going to do as much as we can to get everything into GitHub where you work, where you live. I don't want 5 or 6 other apps that you have to go to find out What version of my app is running on this environment? Did the security scan work? Did all those things? They all should be where your code lives. So that's what my goal is. And really, you can use just about any tools nowadays to do that. It's just how you put them together. It also depends on the languages and the culture of the team. What are they used to? What do they know now? It's very rare that I go into a team that has no software and no experience, and they just want to be taught everything from the ground up. I have not had that contract yet. So it's usually, oh no, this is what we do today. Let's just see if we can make it faster, easier. What my goal is I always want the ops and the dev team to be empowered to make changes to everything in the middle. As long as they follow the same PR process, they get multiple approvals, whatever the process is. We're doing pull requests, we're changing infrastructure as code, and that includes CI and CD. That includes automation. I want all that infrastructure as code. I want it in repos. Even if the ops team isn't developers and they don't know code, they should be storing their stuff. So I change the team's habits so that they're storing all this stuff and that everyone's empowered to improve it. Doesn't mean that you can just rogue go in and change something on your own. You still are going to have to adhere to your company policies, like 1 or 2 approvals in your PRs before they go into main or master. So that process is what I try to stick to for infrastructure, right? If the team's not using Terraform to make their infrastructure, I try to get them there because I think Terraform and Ansible are really the ways to go for infrastructure, for building it out from scratch, right? And that way, you can, if you put it into code into a repo, then their developers can start seeing how the infrastructure is managed if they want to help. So I always try to do that, get everything out in the open so that all the teams can at least see it, if not edit it. It's a shared responsibility, so I want everyone to have access. Let's say I'm an application with around 15 containers. Should I host them with Kubernetes or use the cloud provider container hosting? The cloud provider will take care of scaling metrics and more. I want an efficient solution for less cost. Any advice? Justin, yes. So if you have 15 containers, so is it 15 containers, meaning like one app in each? So I would use a cloud-hosted Kubernetes. If you're on AWS, I would try to go Fargate, which is you don't even have to care about the nodes. They just take care of those for you. If you're on Google Cloud would have autopilot. Azure has their own. Everyone has sort of that next level from, you can start the basics and say, I'm going to make my own servers and I'm going to install Kubernetes on it. That's the hardest way to go. The next easiest thing is I'm going to run EKS or AKS or Google Cloud Kubernetes. Like any of these sort of, the Kubernetes cost is very minimal. It only adds a little bit, like maybe $10, $20 a month, depending on your setup. And then you still have to manage the nodes, which means you still have to update them for security patches. You still have to replace them, upgrade the versions and everything or whatever. You have to still patch and reboot it. So you're still doing server management. And now we have these higher level automations where you don't manage the nodes. It does it for you. That's still Kubernetes. So if you had that many containers and you're a team of a couple of people, like if it's just one person, I say Google Cloud Run, I say DigitalOcean apps, I say anything that you can avoid Kubernetes. And you're just making container images, and then you're using these other higher level abstractions, other higher tools to put the different parts of your app together. So you don't have to have Kubernetes YAML. You can do that as well, but if you're wanting to invest in sort of the Kubernetes concepts, which I think is valuable for any team, because then your app is very portable. Kubernetes is meant to be that layer to give us a set of restrictions, a set of resource types, and if we adhere to that, we can usually move our app with just a little bit of trouble. Ingress and storage, networking are sometimes different, but you can move your stuff around to every cloud based on your needs, or you can be multi-cloud, or you can host privately if you decide to later. And that's what Kubernetes is really giving us. It's a common developer. I consider it the application deployer and application developer API for the data center and the cloud. So that's what Kubernetes is bringing us. If you don't care about that, then you can just run containers any way that the cloud will let you. Every one of them now, it's a joke now that like every cloud provider has a dozen ways to run containers. So most of them will market the easiest way to you first. At least that's my experience. Like you start looking up, how do I run a container in your cloud? They'll give you, you'll find a page that maybe talks about the different parts and the different options you have. So hopefully that helps. Yeah, we are using and building a few Kubernetes operators, but I won't recommend it because it's costly, it's complicated. Yeah. Barack saying, is it fair to compare K8s to Docker? Yeah, I mean, I think that's in comment to my earlier thing. So yes, I think it is because they are both tools that run containers. I will often say that Kubernetes doesn't actually run containers. It just tells the runtime to run the container. So Kubernetes doesn't actually run containers itself. It needs a runtime to control. But it's good to compare the two because they showed up around the same time, only a couple of years apart, and they both run container images. So yes, I think absolutely. But also, yes, totally different scopes, right? Docker's just trying to solve the problem. Docker run is just for one server. Kubernetes obviously isn't. So yeah, it just depends on what how you're thinking that day. Do I want to compare them? Hello, James. Networking in K8s. Payam, coming with the hard questions. Nice. Better understanding of networking in Kubernetes. So it depends on, better is relative, right? I think that networking, I have slides, so you can go check out. I'm not going to pull those up, but if you go to container training, a lot of my workshop training that goes more in depth, it hasn't made it into the courses yet. But if you go to open source container.training, a friend of mine, Jerome Petazzoni, the original DevOps engineer at Docker, back before Docker was Docker, he has, down at the very bottom of this website, these are all free and open source trainings and tutorials. And so we both use these tools, these slides, thousands of them. And if you go down the very bottom and you do deploying and scaling with Kubernetes, you get 2,200 slides. It's a little misleading because it's actually sometimes a bullet is considered a slide, but you have a lot of pages here to go through, and you can see all these different parts. Now, a lot of these parts are in my Kubernetes Mastery course, but as you get to the more advanced networking stuff, that hasn't made it into the course yet, but the slides are still there. So you can start learning about, I'm just going to pick some topics here. Network policies, authentication and authorization, which is technically network related a little bit. It's like, how do you get into the cluster, right? Pod security admission, which not really networking maybe. Securing the control plane is probably a little bit more about networking in there. Running a console cluster, that's not networking really. Portworx is storage. OpenEBS is storage. This is logging, monitoring, namespace quotas, cluster auto-scaling, cluster metrics. There's just so much stuff in here, right? So there's probably something in here about answering your question. So go to container training, container networking interface, CNI internals, building your own cluster, cloud controller manager. Yeah, just a ton of stuff in there. Now, once you decide what networking driver, essentially, the CNI that you're going to use, like Cilium, which is a very popular one, then you need to start diving into Cilium. And Cilium's documentation is going to have probably some images, diagrams, the way you configure it, because it supports things like network policies that are kind of like a firewall inside of Kubernetes, right? But out of the box, a lot of these distributions may not have that. And so it's very dependent, the networking. But the general rules of Kubernetes are all nodes need to be on the same flat network, be able to see each other and talk to each other unrestricted. All pods need to be able to see each other on a flat network and be able to talk unrestricted. And then that's at the low level. That's at the hardware level, networking hardware level. That all needs to be true. Once that's true, then you layer on these software solutions on top of it that all use the Linux kernel to control access and to control ports and to control which things talk to which things. That's all network policy. So hopefully that helps. I don't have a quick example diagram to show you, but it's in those slides. Great questions. DevOps for managers sounds like a great course. Thank you, Pierre. I do agree. I wish it existed. I want to create it. I actually had someone working with me on it, and Unfortunately, they got stuck on other projects so that we couldn't finish it before they got moved on to other things, and life happened and COVID happened. So we want to get back to that, but right now I'm still building on my own, so it will take longer, unfortunately. Please include SRE concepts also in your next course. Terms like SLI, SLO, SLA, toil, error, budget. Yeah, that would definitely be a section, or at least a few videos in the Docker. Sorry, not the Docker. In the DevOps fundamentals course, or the DevOps for management course, because people throw those buzzwords around, right? And so we would talk about all of like the analytics you need to do, meantime to recovery, MTR, all of the different acronyms, and then we will start probably having a couple of videos I think are already listed in there in our syllabus that we're creating around all the basics SRE and sort of comparing SRE to DevOps, and yeah, that's all going to be in there. Thank you for the suggestions. Nadir, what is my reasons for using EKS versus Fargate? I always default to Fargate. I don't want to manage infrastructure if I don't have to. It's not that much more money for a business to run Fargate. It's way more money to hire a DevOps engineer, and they're hard to find. So Fargate helps me avoid running my own nodes and making sure that I patch them and replace them, or having idle nodes that I'm not using but I didn't scale down because I didn't have that all set up, right? So those all things happen. You get rid of that with Fargate, but Fargate has things it can't do. It can't do all the storages. It doesn't have all the ways for you to do things in Kubernetes. It's a limited subset. So I start with Fargate. If I have to be on AWS, I will use Fargate first. If Fargate can't meet our needs, then I have to back up to EKS, and then I'll do that. Hopefully that helps. Hello, Brian. Most important thing to be concerned about in Kubernetes security? Olamide. Sorry if I mispronounced that. That's a very interesting question. Honestly, if you're letting the cloud manage your Kubernetes, they're good at it. They're probably better than you at it. They're better than me at it. They have entire teams managing the design and the configuration. So theirs is going to be as secure as I would expect it to be, which is the cloud doesn't want to get hacked. That would be very bad news if their stuff was weak. So if you're following their defaults, if you're following their recommendations, and you're using their Kubernetes that they made, you should be pretty good. RBAC's going to be enabled. If you're on AWS, they're going to use their built-in security, their VPC security. That's all there. What I see people that often do is Kubernetes isn't going to make your app safer, right? So I often find that images are full of vulnerabilities. So they need to start scanning automatically on every commit on GitHub or wherever you store your code. I see that they, let's see, what else? In their apps, they have way too many dependencies. Like they have dev dependencies in there, so it's bloated. They maybe aren't using a WAF, a web application firewall. If it's a web system that's forward-facing, especially to the internet, I want some sort of advanced WAF protection in front of that. That's usually provided by the cloud. So I don't want to manage that or run it myself. I want to have them run it, and it's going to help protect me from zero-day exploits, right? And other things that, SQL injections and all those things. That's what WAFs are supposed to be designed for. Also, do something with your code. Have your code have static analysis scanning like CodeQL. That's in GitHub, comes with GitHub at certain levels, CodeQL. So I'm scanning my code for known weaknesses in the design of my code, right? Because the CVE scanner is only looking at your dependencies. It's not looking at your app if you're making apps. So I find that those areas are often weakness. I find that the team is put everything in Kubernetes, but then they put a database and then they made that database public. They put it outside. They put the database port on the internet. So that's bad, right? Like, so those things you can't solve with Kubernetes security. I would say that probably other than that, if we're talking about Kubernetes infrastructure and you deployed it in the cloud, you're using the cloud's managed Kubernetes, then be careful with the add-ons because there are a lot of things, dashboards, GUIs, things. And if they have kubeadmin and you make them public, whatever those tools are, you're adding risk. So that might be where you use Tailscale. And then the only way you can get to the Kubernetes API or any of your management tools, right, like Argo, like the Kubernetes dashboard, any of these management tools, they should be behind something because if there's ever an exploit, or if someone has a weak password or something, that's going to be a vector to attack your clusters. And if they have access to an admin tool, they own everything. If they have admin on your clusters, they can change anything in production. So you don't want that. So I would put all of that management infrastructure, that DevOps stuff, all those things that have, equivalent of root, essentially. If they have kubeadmin, they are essentially root. And it's not just root on a server, it's like root on everything in the cluster. So I would protect those very much and make sure that they're behind a VPN of some sort. At minimum, a high port with monitored login logs, right? So that when someone's trying to brute force you or trying to get in. But that's why I would rather have it all protected behind a VPN. So great question. Oh, Dan, a pod can be many containers, and there's multiple types of containers you can have in that pod. For example, you can have an init container, which I use often in projects where we need to do a database upgrade, like a database schema update before the container starts. So init containers will always start before the other containers, and the init container has to be successful. So yes, pods have that much more flexibility with that. And it's not, I'd say 95% of workloads have one container and one pod. It's not everything, unless you're deciding you're going to sidecar everything and put some sort of logging agent in a sidecar to follow logs, which I don't really recommend. I try to avoid any sidecars or any complicated stuff. I really try to have everything just ship your logs to Kubernetes, let Kubernetes log drivers and logging infrastructure handle that for you. So I don't need sidecars. Of course, if you do things like service mesh or ingress, those sometimes can show up as sidecars a little bit. And those would be extra containers in the pods. If you do service mesh, you realize that like everything ends up having another proxy next to it. That can be complicated. Cloud Surfer says EKS Fargate does not support event-driven applications. Yeah, so that's kind of like there's a focus on, like, Lambda does certain things, but it can only fit those things, and Fargate can only do those things. And then Google Cloud Run or other things that can only run a single containered app, and it's easier than Kubernetes. They can only do certain things. So that's the things. I usually try to start with those really high abstractions and work my way down. And then eventually, if I have to, then I run Kubernetes YAML. And then if for some reason it just won't Kubernetes, like it just won't work at all, then, the last resort is I run it on a server and I have to build a server and all that jazz, right? I don't really have to do that ever. But I always try to start with the easiest solutions. And that's kind of what the point of these clouds is, that you can pick and choose. Not everything doesn't have to be a Kubernetes pod in your life. Doesn't have to be. Thoughts on Marantis as a company? Sure. I've never worked with them. I don't hear anything bad about them. They have lots of people working there, and they make enterprise Kubernetes solutions. I know they have lots of customers. They still have hundreds of Swarm customers that pay them for Swarm. But yeah, I follow their blog, so I read their blog articles. But that's all I really know. They're the ones that support Lens, though. So if you like Lens, that's Marantis. They have other open source tools. Their own Kubernetes. They have multiple Kubernetes distributions. So yeah, I think they're fine. Haven't heard anything negative. Flat network in Kubernetes. Doesn't Docker Swarm do the same? That's a great question, Cloud Surfer. So technically, no. So Docker, it's possible for Docker nodes to be between... let me back up. Docker networking by default uses an encapsulated network model, a VXLAN model. So the overlay driver wraps your packets into another packet and then sends those over a common port. That way, you don't have to open up every port on every node. You do normally have to do that by default, not always, in Kubernetes. There are efforts and tools and things to get around some of those limitations with Kubernetes. But Docker out of the box, you could actually have 3 different nodes all firewalled off, and as long as you had the certain ports open, everything would work, because it wraps up those packets in their own little tunnel, and almost like a VPN, it sends it over a specific port that you can predict. On Kubernetes, it doesn't assume that out of the gate, so it expects nodes to be able to talk on any port, and so trying to get those on more than just a flat network becomes much more complicated, and I've not seen a complicated setup like that worked without lots of effort and lots of tooling. So typically with Kubernetes, the rule out of the gate is flat networks everywhere. Docker's a little more flexible, I think, out of the box. You know, Docker just works that way. That's a great question. Oh, Akash, or Akash. So I'm going to try your name different ways. Sorry. Yes. So O'Reilly has some great books on distributed computing, Kubernetes, Kubernetes networking. I think there's a few other ones that I recommend. Cloud Native, there's a Cloud Native one. I recommend a lot of those because they're all coming from the same community. O'Reilly, Manning too, but O'Reilly tends to have like a lot of the lead authors writing books that are well known in the community and people that are really good experts at it. Can I comment on running multiple replicas where state must be preserved? A site with a login, the next page visit has to go back to the same container. Well, state, okay, so state have to be preserved, or can you just use sticky sessions for that? So, yeah. Maybe give me more answers on that, Biker. I'm not really sure exactly what that. So give me more details. But yeah, at first I would default to sticky sessions. So that when you get to that, it basically does long polling. It puts a cookie, and you stay with that container unless that container goes down. And then the next thing I might do is, well, I guess I'm assuming you haven't been able to change the app, right? So some apps that they don't do a database or shared memory, Memcache, whatever tool, Redis, to store the state. So it's per node only. And to me, sticky sessions is always the way to get around that. But if you can't do that, I don't really have an easy thing other than just seeing if the app is composable where I can change it and just change the back end. Sometimes you can do that with very little effort, actually. And like depending on the frameworks you're using, you can just toggle a setting, and instead of it storing state in memory, it'll store it remotely in a database of some kind. And maybe you can even just change the environment config and not have to redesign an app. I don't know. So feel free to give me more details if you'd like. Is there a Kubernetes session? Oh, I just saw your other question. Is there a Kubernetes setting to maintain session? That would seem to be an ingress controller issue. Yeah, it's nothing Kubernetes specific. But in fact, it's not just ingress. So you put that in your ingress config, but you also probably have front-end load balancers that are hardware that also need to be set up for sticky sessions. You probably also want some sort of headers or proxy headers. You have to. It just depends on the solution, but that's to me all ingress, which is vendor specific, right? It's going to be very specific annotations or configuration for that resource, that type of resource for that ingress provider. And then you have to enable that for the rules that you need to be sticky, because sticky is usually not default. And then you have to go to the load balancers in your cloud and make sure that sticky is enabled for them. And then you might need multiple load balancers if you're using cloud hardware, where some are enabled for sticky and some aren't, because it's kind of it's a universal setting, right? It's the job of the front end thing to put that cookie down if that's going to be, because the load balancer has to make sure it gets you to the right container, and that can be multiple hops. So you might have to have multiple settings of sticky sessions all the way down. So yeah, that's not a Kubernetes concern, because Kubernetes and services don't know level 7, right? OSI, stack, IP layer 7, that is where the HTTP sessions are going to be, and that's what you need to concern yourself with. And services, for example, in Kubernetes are only layer, they're the TCP and UDP layer. So that's what, layer 5, layer 4. Oh, man, I need to go back and read my TCP IP Unleashed book. But they're at low level, right? And then pods are even lower level than that, where they're just like layer 3. So, yeah, that answers your question, hopefully. Design question from Dan. I would like to use Spring Config Server in Kubernetes using Vault. Kubernetes has config map and secrets. Do I really need this microservice? I don't know. That's a very Spring Config Server. I've never even heard of Spring Config Server. let's use Spring Config Server in Kubernetes using Vault. So Vault is going to be your secrets provider, right? Kubernetes itself can store the secrets without Vault, but if you're going to use Vault, then you're going to need to use the Vault secrets provider, which basically uses Kubernetes to go get the secret. So I'm not sure, Dan, on which microservice you're actually talking about. If you're talking about Spring Config Server, I don't know. We are, by the way, going to have the Vault team on the show. We got more shows coming this year from HashiCorp. Their DevRel team is going to help me out and get some people on the show. We're going to talk about Terraform. We're going to have a show on Terraform. We're going to have a show on Vault. Console, maybe. I think we're going to do... I'm not sure if we're breaking them up yet, but those are all coming. So come back. Martin says we use MKE. Very cool. How do we scale container resource requests and limits? So you can use, you can start out with just doing that in your pod spec for each pod. When you're writing your YAML, you put that in there. But if you need to set more universal policies, there's something, we just had someone on the show recently from Kyverno, which is a policy engine that would help you basically set up some space settings. Then your app devs don't have to do so much work in their, they don't have to be experts in their YAML on the pod spec, and you can set it up more universally, sort of generic defaults or group-based policy stuff. And it's for a whole lots of, basically everything, resource, security, all that stuff is you can use their open source tools. And then they are now creating a SaaS product on top of this. So you can also check that out here on their website. So, yeah, Nirmata, I said Nirmata is their cloud-based version of this. So it makes it easier to set up policy. It checks policy. So, got some spammers in here today. All right. How do we scale container resource requests? We already did that. Any good Kubernetes training projects to get you started into the world of Kubernetes learning? James, learning by doing, etc. Well, that's my courses. So you're talking about other than the courses below with the links and the coupons? I don't have more. I mentioned earlier container training, container.training. All the way at the bottom, there's a bunch of slides. There's 2,000 slides on Kubernetes, including hands-on the whole time. And it's meant to be self-paced. So again, back to the, let me see if I can find that container training. Yeah, container.training. So take my courses first. That's videos, that's assignments. I have a Docker mastery that includes Kubernetes, and I have Kubernetes mastery that's just Kubernetes, all that stuff. So check that out, James. Kubernetes services have a flag to make sticky sessions possible. Anil, I didn't know about that. So how does a sticky session work if services don't support, they don't understand layer 7? That's actually, I'll have to check into that. But ingress is where you provide HTTP configuration, not in services. So maybe if you're talking about the load balancer, like a load balancer service, that might be true because you're actually controlling a remote load balancer, and that load balancer may actually include OSI layer 7 functionality for HTTP protocol. If you have links or information, and I'd love to see what you're talking about, so we can, I can, if I need to learn something new that I didn't know about, please help me. Seems like sticky session, David says, it kind of defeats the purpose of scaling and scheduling. Well, that's true. Usually the worst case, if you have to hop, so sticky sessions often are for legacy apps, right? And we got to keep those legacy apps till we can replace them. So you don't want to make Kubernetes that place where only new apps can go in it, because then you'll be running legacy apps the legacy way forever. So you got to get those legacy apps forward. And sometimes we don't have the source code. We can't change them, or we're not allowed to change them, or whatever. So I do see a lot of legacy apps having to include sticky sessions. But the worst case, almost always, the worst case with a sticky session is if like, let's say you replace containers every day, is that someone just is forced to relog in. So they basically get a new container, they've lost their session state because it maybe wasn't stored in a centralized location, which is even, you can do centralized disk storage for sessions. So that way, when the new container spins up on that node, it still gets the same session list and technically could survive a restart or a recreation of the container pod, of the pod's container. So you technically can do that, but sticky sessions, usually the worst case scenario is they just have to relog in. Granted, if you're not doing updates every day, that's not a huge issue. If you have maintenance windows, if you're still one of those teams that's lucky enough to have maintenance windows, then sticky session replacement is okay for you, I think, probably, because people would expect to have to relog in after an update or something. It just depends on the team and the culture and who your users are and your requirements, really. So, but that's a good point, David. Thank you. Foxy Headhunter, I had a 3rd-round interview for support engineer at Morantis next week, and since you have such knowledge of this type of IT space, I wanted to hear your opinion. Oh, okay. I appreciate that. Yeah, well, good luck on that. Good luck. You can do it. We believe in you. Oh, yeah, Spring Boot has a Spring Cloud config server. Yeah, sorry, Dan, I'm not going to be able to help from there. Hello, Xavier from Spain. And Kit, sometimes pods get out of memory and processes get killed. We have to update the requests and limits manually. Any solution to this? Yes. Yes. What you want is vertical pod autoscaler. All right. What you're looking for is known as the vertical pod autoscaler. It automatically adjusts the CPU and memory reservations for your pods to help right-size your application. All right. So there's at least 3 times of autoscaling. So if you go back in this show, we actually talk about the different types of autoscaling. Now, we don't implement a vertical pod autoscaler, but if you go back just in this channel, go and click the search button in this channel and search for autoscaling, you'll find just in the last few months, we did a whole show on autoscaling, and we talked about the different types. And there's a new project I had a friend on, Nermal. And so if you look back, it's a purple logo. The video image is purple because I remember making it or having approved it. I didn't actually make that image. So autoscaler, there's a new type of autoscaler out that we were talking about, but it doesn't focus on vertical pod autoscaling, which is what you want. So check that out. I'm just catching up on chat. My scenario, lead only access to secrets. So how do we prevent team members from being able to log into pods and access the secrets? Granted, it's base 64 encoded by anyone can decrypt. So a couple of things on secrets. So secrets in cluster by default, if you're using a properly built cluster, secrets are encrypted in the database, but not in the pod. They can't be, right? Because the application has to be able to read them. So don't give your developers access to the pod. Why do they need access to the pod? What your developers should be doing is they edit YAML manifests or customize or Helm charts, and then they edit Argo YAML to update the version that they want to deploy. Those are things that go in Git repos, and you use pull requests. And then you use something like Argo CD or Flux. Argo CD is what I typically use nowadays. But you use that to automatically update the server from their code based on what they changed in YAML. So they get to control the YAML, and there's a pull request, and you can force someone from your team to have to approve it if you really want to control the workflow there. But you allow them to edit the YAML, and then the system updates itself, and they don't need any access to kube control. You can give them the dashboard or some other GUI that's read-only. You can give them access to Argo CD to see the status of deployments and all that stuff. But you don't give them any write access there. You just let them see it. And so a developer, you really don't want anyone, really not just developers, but devs and ops and DevOps, when all those people or security, to go into a cluster or into a pod and change or get anything. So for example, I like sealed secrets rather than Vault, which requires infrastructure or a SaaS component. I like sealed secrets for small environments. Sealed secrets, just look up that, it's one word, look up that project. Sealed secrets allows me to use PKI technology, the standard internet public key encryption, and take the secrets that a developer has, right? Because usually a developer has some secrets, ops has some other secrets, and you can put them in Git safely because they're encrypted. And the only place they can be decrypted is on the cluster. And the only people that can get that certificate and like sneak it out of the cluster are the admins of the cluster. And the only people that need to be admin are a very small group of people. And if you set up your security well, you have it to the point where even the password to the cluster is stored in some system where you have to get someone else's permission to get it. So there's lots of tools out there. These are more IT tools for infrastructure management and secret access. And it's one of those things where you can really lock it down to where day to day a developer never has access to the pods directly or to kube control, CLI directly. They just get web GUIs and statuses of things. And when they need to update their code, they're updating it in GitHub or in Bitbucket or wherever your Git is stored. All right? That's how I would do it. Great question, Cloud Surfer. Yeah, so Zolt's saying the same thing. Yeah, you don't give them access to the clusters. I mean, you can give them access to the, like a dev cluster, so they can, do whatever they want, run commands. But nowadays, I usually don't even do that either. If the dev cluster has very specific YAMLs in GitHub that they go and edit. If they want to tinker around with Kubernetes and run stuff on Kubernetes, I make sure that they have a local environment they can use. Or maybe they're using remote Kubernetes with something like Scaffold or whatever for dev purposes. But I don't normally give them like raw kube control to server clusters I'm running in the cloud or in a data center. I usually restrict them to just the YAML. And then I help them. I teach them. I have workshops with them. I listen. I try to understand their workflows, and I change it up so that I can give them all the information and status they need without giving them unnecessary permissions like cluster admin. Hopefully that can work for you. Console and etcd, I'm not going to be smart enough, sorry, brain power, to tell you the real difference. They're Console and etcd are very niche products, and you tend to know when you need them, at least in my experience. If I need a Kubernetes cluster, I'm most likely running it on etcd. My distribution most likely chooses that for me. For example, if I want to run Nomad, then I'm going to probably use Console because that's how it supports it. If I'm using K3S, well, usually you can avoid etcd. But if you're an application designer, then you're going to pick the one that has the features. They're both solid, maybe close to a decade old, or at least 5 years old as products. I don't know the inception date of them, but I'm not smart enough on the nuances of each to really know which one works for which. I just know they're both well-maintained, stable products that are used by thousands, if not millions, of people. Great question. I just don't have a good answer. What would be the best way for you to use headless services? Got asked that in an interview. What would be the best scenario for using headless services? Well, I'm not. It's kind of a vague question, but they're probably just fishing for an answer. So here would be my pitch. So I'm going to try to still standardize on images. I'm assuming that I'm still going to be using Kubernetes, and those headless services are not going to need to have published ports, right? So I'm not going to need services for them. I'm not going to need to worry about ingress rules for them, and I'm going to run them as a deployment, assuming they don't have state. If they have state, I might use a daemon set or a stateful set. I'm just going to use a standard deployment, and then the real big question is about how do I get health checks and probes of those headless services. So if there's no port to ping or test, how do I do that? Well, the common way to do that is to write in the code itself. So you have to have source code control of the application, but I'm going to write into that application a way for it to write out a file. And essentially, as long as it's functioning correctly, it's going to write status to a file, and then I'm going to have my probes check that file. I can also technically have a sidecar that listens on a port, and that sidecar is a custom-written application that checks the file date, right? It's looking for that file to have been touched or written to with a status code or whatever you want to do. By the way, this is in the Kubernetes documentation. They actually talk about this in Kubernetes documentation as an example of taking worker jobs, right, or jobs that just don't have a port to test. And that's what you do with them. That's one of the ways you monitor those. So that's actually where I would focus, because a lot of times those worker processes or those headless processes, they go unmonitored because people don't know how to monitor a thing that doesn't have an open port. So that's what I would do. I would focus on the monitoring aspect because it kind of shows that you understand the problems of headless. And if that's what they're going after, we're talking infrastructure here. So I'm assuming that that's what you were talking about is infrastructure. So if it's an infrastructure question, a DevOps kind of question, then that's my approach to it is how do I update it like every other app? I deploy it like every other app, and it just needs to have, it has less stuff because it doesn't need to have ports open. And then I have to worry about state if it has state problems, and then I have to worry about monitoring. So good question. All right, we're going to ask a couple more questions. I've been going for almost 2 hours, so my voice is starting to go. So a few more questions. Get your questions in now, your last questions, and then we'll answer the last few. By the way, I do this every month. So if you're just now showing up, Udemy Q&A about the courses, anything DevOps or containers, I do it every month, once a month, back here on Thursdays on YouTube Live. You sign up on my Patreon below. Patreon for free. You can get updates and know when these are going to happen. All right, you'll see the updates on a weekly basis in email. They said it would be better to use headless service stateful sets if we had a DB pod that will connect with the app pod, restricting outside internet to DB pod. That is true. So you have you have those three main ways to deploy your pods: is stateful sets, daemon sets, and deployments. Deployments are like 90%, right? It's just put my app wherever it fits, wherever the requirements are met. I don't really care. And then stateful sets give you consistent naming. It makes sure that each replica of that set has all the right identifiers, the names, and other settings that you need to make sure that, like a database and its mirror, for example, or if you had a 3-node MongoDB, those fit better with stateful sets. And then daemon sets are where you want to make sure that one's on each node, right? So maybe it's a monitoring tool, logging tool, something like that. So it's the three main ways. There are other ways. There's ephemeral, there's init containers, there's all these other things, but yeah. So hopefully you got a good answer in that interview. I'm not sure if they would have liked my answer. They might have been looking for something different. Yeah, I think our definition of headless here, I look at headless as something that doesn't have a listening port. That's how I see headless. I understand that there's like headless CMS, but that still requires the same exact deployment configuration as a regular web server. It still has an API, which means HTTP, which means a service, means ingress, it means TLS, it means all the same things, right, to me. So as an infrastructure person, I don't distinguish from a headless application in the terms of like a CMS headless or a backend API. But that's a different definition. It's not wrong. It's just I'm thinking from an infrastructure perspective, a headless to me, for example, in services, you can make, I believe it's actually called headless, but it's a very specific term to Kubernetes services, which means, let's see. Yeah. So in services, so if that's what they're asking is a headless service, so here's a link. This is a type of service where it doesn't use the built-in load balancer and IP, the virtual IP. It tells you actually specifically in here what different scenarios you would use a headless, but it's something where, yeah, you would use a database. So maybe what they were asking is, so see, you said headless service. It's very, very key word in your sentence. And I heard service as in like a application in your pod, not a Kubernetes service resource. So in my brain, I wasn't thinking a Kubernetes service that is headless, but that's exactly what this is. So you actually learn this about headless in my Kubernetes mastery course. And yes, that's exactly what you would do. They're exactly correct. Yeah, stateful sets and all that stuff. And here's the real reason why that all happens. And you'll be bitten by this bug if you're like me and you do it wrong. A service by default, when it puts all these pods, it puts them all behind an IP, and that becomes sort of a poor person's load balancer. And what that does is that's taking packets and rewriting them to a different IP, kind of like a gateway or a router or a firewall would do, right? So in that, there are TCP timeouts, there's packet sizes, there's open connection limits, and all these different attributes of the connection that you don't want Kubernetes to get in the way of. And that's really what headless services are about, is getting Kubernetes and the VIP, the virtual IP, out of the way so that when one service needs to talk to that headless service, like your database, that there's nothing in the middle. Right? We're not going to have multiple, in like most traditional SQL databases, you don't have multiple databases behind a single IP address and port, and then it like goes between them. You don't normally do that, right? You want your application to have direct access to the pod running the database without anything else in the way, including an IP exchange or an IP NAT, which is what the virtual IP does in a normal service. That's just one of many different headless reasons that you might have. So good question, and I didn't pick up on that service part right away, so I was probably giving you the wrong answer, or a slightly vague answer. All right. Yeah, thanks, Zolt. Thanks for quoting the docs there. Yeah, and you don't always have to have stateful sets. So like there's deployments, I can do deployments of databases, and this is also something you do in Swarm, by the way. I believe I mentioned this in the Swarm course. If not, I've mentioned it in my DockerCon talks. Like with Swarm, by default, Swarm, when you create an application, it always creates that service, right? That service is a part of the Swarm service. It creates that virtual IP address, and you can turn off that mode and turn on what's called, it calls it DNSRR. That's a different mode when you create Swarm services, because it turns off that VIP so that your application can talk directly to the database. So whether or not I'm running a database in a stateful set or or in a regular deployment, I'm always trying to use a headless service, because I don't want a potential connection problem, whether it's packet size or connection timeouts, right? I don't want any of that in the way. So I don't want, because there are these defaults, right? And at the low level, Kubernetes, when it's using the kubelet to control the local networking, whatever networking provider you're using on the nodes, they're really at the low level using IP tables inside the Kubernetes kernel or in the Linux kernel. So when you create that virtual interface like a default service does, you have potentials for all sorts of issues. And I've had this problem on Postgres. I've had this problem on Redis, where things don't behave. The driver in the app is trying to talk to the database in a certain way, but there's a thing in the middle that's muddling the packets, messing them up and causing timeout issues. A lot of these things, their default timeout, I think, is 5 minutes on the set services. So your database connection that's supposed to be long, forever connected from your app will time, and then it'll time out after 5 minutes, but it's not the database timing out, it's the thing in the middle, and it cuts off the connection and can cause issues. You can also have sometimes performance problems, because if you're doing a lot of database transactions, the exact packet settings aren't the same, and you can have subtle little weird performance problems that you get out of the way by, and it's also just less work on the kernel to have to take that IP address, swap it out for another IP address at the kernel, and then send it on the back end. So, yeah. So, all right. Well, I think that's it. I'm going to say, let's say if we can get one more question. But in deployments, Zolt says pods get random identity. How do you address them if the names are not deterministic without a service that is not headless? Well, you would put a service. So this is what I would do is, sorry, let me make sure I understand the question. But in deployment, pods get random identity. Right. Well, yes. And how do you address them if their names are not deterministic without a service that is not headless? Correct. In that case, if I ran a database as a deployment, the service, the pod, in a single database deployment, if I just roll out a simple little single node Postgres database, its pod name doesn't matter to me, because it has a listening port. I'm always going to make a service. If I'm smart, I'll make a headless service for it. So my point there was just that headless services are good for more than stateful sets, I can also use them with deployments, because the pod name doesn't matter if, you can roll the same database files on a new version of Postgres. You can update the minor version of Postgres by swapping out the container, and it'll pick up the databases and run. It doesn't care that the container name is different. It's the service name that matters, right? Because that's how your apps get to it. So good point. Maybe we're talking about the same thing. Maybe I'm still confused and we're not talking about the same thing. But yeah, I've got plenty of little examples where we don't, we're doing testing, performance, application testing, and we don't care about a redundant, database setup where I need those consistent pod names. Then, I can use a headless service. All right, everyone, that was a great way to end it. A nice deep conversation. Too bad we're not all sipping coffee, sitting around talking about it together. But if you want, by the way, this is the last little plug. By the way, we're here every week. Well, thanks, Zolt. You can check out my Patreon. That's where you can sign up to get all the updates. Who's going to be here next week? Who's going to be here the week after? I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have Anais from Aqua Security here next week. After that, we're going to have 2 staff software engineers from VMware to talk about some open source at VMware. We're then going to have people from Slim AI, a couple of individuals from Slim AI to talk about Docker Slim and automatically making slimmer and better images for you. Slim AI is really cool because it's the idea that you're too busy to micromanage how to get your container even slimmer and smaller. So their goal is to create automation and templating, essentially, to make your Docker files even smaller. Well, when you create that Docker image, it'll make those Docker images even smaller without you doing anything. You basically just tell them where they live, and they'll go and make it smaller for you. So that's going to be on the show next month, and we'll see you then. Until then, come out and check out the Discord server. That's right above me. Come join Discord for free and sign up for the Patreon. And if you're going to be at KubeCon in, 4 months, I will see you there in Detroit. I will be here next week live. Have a good one, everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye.